In this video, we're going to talk about the 2014 Farm Bill, the Agricultural Act of 2014. One of the things that pops up from time to time is this discussion right here. This question: how much does a farm bill cost? And so around the time of the passing of the 2014 Farm Bill, I think this was from the Congressional Budget Office, I'm pretty sure that's who did this estimate, sat down and did a little projection and said that this Farm Bill, the 2014 Farm Bill, over the next 10 years is going to cost $956 billion. Now, the first thing that should pop into your mind if you're a critical thinker is, wait a second, why did they do a 10-year projection when most farm bills are supposed to last 4 or 5 years, and it's very rare that you go longer than 6 years between farm bills because farm bills expire, right? And if you don't pass a new farm bill, you go back to the permanent legislation. So I never understood why this projection was done for 10 years. But that's the projection that was done. So what's the single biggest expenditure item, the title that costs the most in the Farm Bill? And that title is the Food and Nutrition title, which makes up almost 80% of the total cost of the Farm Bill, 79% of the cost of the 2014 Farm Bill. Estimated at $756 billion, again over 10 years. The next largest provision or title of the Farm Bill was the Crop Insurance Provision, which was projected to cost $9 billion a year, so almost $90 billion over the course of 10 years. After that is the conservation programs, where you're going to find things like conservation reserves and the EQIP program and all the various other conservation programs that pop up in the Farm Bill. And at the bottom of this list, it's not the entire list, but at the bottom of this particular list was the actual commodity titles, where the subsidies are hidden at in the Farm Bill, the crop subsidies, $44.5 billion. And one thing to think about that's going on politically in the middle of all this. You may remember back at the beginning of the class, we talked about a concept called the politics of the minority, or minority politics. And this is the idea that if you take 2 or 3 interest groups, I don't like calling them minorities because they might not be a minority in the sense we usually think. They're just interest groups. And if you get several different interest groups together, they can all work together and pass a big bill that has something for everybody that's in the various interest groups in it. We're reaching a point where people are beginning to question the cost of the Farm Bill. It's been going on for decades. And what you're going to notice is that the bulk of the cost of the Farm Bill isn't going into anything that looks like farming. It's going into the Food and Nutrition Program, meaning the SNAP program. We used to call it food stamps. Now, it's not just SNAP. There's other food and nutrition programs as well. For example, there's one called WIC, W-I-C, that stands for Women, Infants, and Children. This is direct food aid that's given out to the parents of very young children. It's given out to women, infants, and children, just like the name says. So it's more than just the SNAP program and the Food and Nutrition Program, but the Food and Nutrition title is the most expensive title. What about those Commodity Credit Corporation non-recourse marketing loans? Still there, mostly unchanged. The way that it has been for a long time, you've still got a loan rate that the farmer can take out a marketing loan, a non-recourse marketing loan, just like we've been studying all semester, or treat it like a target price with a deficiency payment and just take that loan deficiency payment, the LDP. Now, in the previous Farm Bill, we had this thing called ACRE, A-C-R-E, which was a revenue protection program. ACRE has been replaced. So in the 2014 Farm Bill, ACRE morphed into these two things here: price loss coverage, PLC, and agricultural risk coverage, ARC. And what I want to point out to you is the language of these things: loss, risk. The language is the language you would use if you were talking about insurance. Now, these are just target prices with deficiency payments, but as I have alluded to before, the justification for subsidizing row crop producers has started to change. Back in the day, you go back in time to the beginning of our farm bills, the justification was that farmers were broke, they weren't getting enough money for their products out in the open marketplace, and historically, incomes in rural areas have been lower than incomes in urban areas. Country folk were poor, city folk were rich. That's what historically happens. So that's flipped. So you no longer can justify having agricultural subsidies on the grounds that farmers are poor and they need help. Because guess what? They're not poor anymore. But we still justify the policy on the grounds that they need some help because farming is risky. Prices rise, prices fall, prices do what prices do. Farmers don't have any control over that. One year you have great weather, one year you have terrible weather, so your yield rises, your yield falls. You don't have any control over that. So there's still a considerable amount of risk in agriculture. And even though the policy is the exact same target price with a deficiency payment, we keep changing the way it's described in the policy to make it look more and more like a risk reduction insurance type of thing. So let's talk about the ARC program for a little bit. We'll start there. There's two types of ARC program. There's the individual ARC and the county ARC. So the way this works is the farmer gets to choose whether they want to engage in the PLC program or the ARC program. And when you pick, you're locked in until the next farm bill, right? You're locked into it. And inside of the ARC program, there's two types of ARC, ARC individual, ARC county. And once again, if you pick ARC individual, when you should have picked ARC county, well, you're locked into that choice until basically the next farm bill rolls around when you'll have the opportunity to switch. So the way the ARC program works is both the ARC individual and the ARC county will provide a payment when the actual revenue, and by actual I mean your actual revenue if you chose ARC individual, or the county's actual revenue if you chose ARC county, fall below a revenue guarantee. Now, this sounds a lot like a target price with a deficiency payment. It really is, only instead of guaranteeing a price, they're guaranteeing a revenue. And that's really important because revenue is equal to price times yield. And this guarantee is not the benchmark revenue, it's 86% of that benchmark revenue. We end up with this calculation right here. We have to have a calculation of the benchmark. And it's very similar to how we calculate base. So if you choose the county level, they're going to take an Olympic average of the U.S. price over the last 5 years. So a nationwide price over the last 5 marketing years, and they'll do an Olympic average. By Olympic average, we mean we're going to take the highest and the lowest and throw them out, the way they do whenever you're watching gymnastics on the Olympics. And then we take an Olympic average county yield for those 5 years. So we take the county you're in, we average all the farmers' yields for those 5 years, toss the highest year, toss the lowest year, and 3 years, right? Average those 3 years, and that is the county benchmark revenue. All right, so that's the benchmark calculation if you pick ARC county. Now there's a benchmark calculation if you pick ARC individual, and the calculation is a weighted average, and the weight is by the percentage of what you planted, and that's how they come up with the benchmark for the two types. Now, to make things more complicated, there's a benchmark, and now they have to do a revenue calculation, meaning what is your actual revenue on your farm. If you chose ARC county, they're going to use the average yield in your county for the particular year, and then either or the loan rate, right, because we still have our non-recourse marketing loans and our loan deficiency payments, so either or the loan rate or the national average market price for the year. So if the market price is higher than the loan rate, we pick the market price. If the loan rate's higher, we pick the loan rate. So your revenue calculation will be based on the loan rate. If you chose the individual, we're going to do a weighted average of the commodities grown on your individual farm. So you might grow wheat and cotton and corn and soybeans and several different things. So we're going to do basically an average of what you've grown for your yield, right, to get your yield, and then multiply that again by national price or the loan rate, whichever is higher. So that's your revenue calculation. So we have, roll back a second, a benchmark calculation and one for each, and a revenue calculation and one for each. My hope is you're beginning to see that there's a lot of calculations here, and it's getting interesting. But we haven't yet calculated what the payment is. We've calculated your benchmark, we've calculated your actual revenue. Now we need to calculate your payment, and the payment is the revenue guarantee, right, the benchmark, minus your actual revenue, multiplied by the number of acres that you produced, or maybe your base acres, I think is what it is. And for the county level, you multiply it by 0.85. And for the individual, you multiply it by 0.65. And so this is really important. You only get 65% of the payment if you're on the individual. You get 85% if you're on the county. And what that basically means is that for the individual to be better than the county, that number, guarantee minus actual, has to be a lot bigger than it is for the county. So what you're not looking at what your yield is, you're looking at what your guarantee is and what your actual is. And the bigger the difference between your guaranteed revenue and your actual revenue, the bigger your payment. And if you choose the ARC individual, that gap has to be a lot larger to make the same money as a farmer that chose the ARC county. This puts the farmer into a tough position because it's 2014 and they have to pick the PLC, which we'll get to in a second, or one of these two right here. And there was much confusion and much debate as to whether or not farmers could actually figure out what would be best for them, because it's going to require a lot of seeing into the future. Now let's talk about the PLC, the price loss coverage. So this one right here looks more like our target price with deficiency payment than the previous one did. So the ARC, let's go back and the ARC ones, the ARC county and the ARC individual, those were revenue protection. Those protected your farm if the revenue fell below a certain level. And what you've got to remember is that sometimes your revenue can fall because your yield collapsed. And sometimes your revenue can fall because prices bottomed out. Okay, and the two things tend to be indirectly related. Typically, your price is going to be higher when yields are lower, because if there's a nationwide drought, your yield's going to be terrible, but you're going to get a higher price, and vice versa. The natural hedge, I think we talked about that in the last video. So that's the ARC, the PLC. Let's talk about it. So the payment is triggered if the effective price is less than the reference price. So what they're saying is the effective price is going to be a national average market price or the loan rate. So the loan rate is the effective price, right? Or rather, the loan rate is a price floor. So the effective price is either going to be the loan rate or the market price if the market price is higher, right? Whichever is higher. So it's just a target price with a deficiency payment. You've got an effective price, you got a reference price. If the effective price is below the reference price, you get a check. Now the reference prices were actually listed in the Farm Bill. You can go and look them up. For example, it was $3.70 a bushel in corn. And what you've got to remember here is that in previous policies, we used a base to get our reference prices. We used a historic average. But now it's hard-coded in the Farm Bill what the dollar amount is, and that is an important difference. Now, how does your payment work? If you elect to go with the PLC route instead of the ARC route, you're going to take the reference price minus the effective price, which is basically a loan deficiency payment, multiplied by your payment yield. So there's a system for calculating what your yield should be on your farm, multiplied by your payment acres. Again, there's a baseline yield in acres, and multiply that by 0.85. So you basically, that first part, reference price minus effective price, and then the government finds some way to calculate what your production is, because yield times acres is your production. And so it's your production multiplied by the deficiency payment, multiplied by 0.85, you only get 85% of it. And those yields and acres are based on some historical base. So that's the PLC program. And it really is just a target price with a deficiency payment. There's no other way to hide it. Let's talk a little bit about the conservation title in the 2014 Farm Bill. The conservation title is where the EQIP program is hiding. That's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And as I mentioned in previous lectures, the USDA has significant leeway in how they apply the EQIP program. For example, the current trendy thing is cover crops, because the USDA has decided to subsidize cover crops. And they use the EQIP program to do that. So if you were to go digging into the EQIP program, what you would find is a list of things that Congress said the USDA could do. And the USDA can look at that list and say, this year we think that numbers 4, 6, and 7 are a good idea, and we're going to throw money into them. Because the Farm Bill gives the USDA the authority to do it. This decision the USDA makes on how they spend that EQIP money has the full force of law, and we talked about that before. So I want to talk about this for a second here. I want to talk about the breakdown of SNAP benefits. Now, there's this popular narrative that minorities receive more financial benefits from the federal government. And if you look at the actual data for the SNAP program, that's not true. So in 2010, 63% of the U.S. population was white, 12.3% was African American. And then in 2012, just 2 years later, 63.7% of the people who were receiving SNAP benefits were white and 12.2% were black. And the rest were Hispanic or Asian or others. They just grouped them into other in the textbook. I don't know what the breakdown was. And what you're going to notice is that it's proportional, and the differences are within a margin of statistical error. So if you think that, only poor minorities are the ones getting the food stamps, completely not true. Just does not bear out in the statistics. So whenever you hear people say things, check it with the data, because a lot of people have ideas in their head that just don't jive with the data. Let's talk about the 2018 Farm Bill before we wrap this up. So here's what you got to know about the 18 Farm Bill. There aren't any significant changes between 14 and 18. ARC and PLC County and PLC Individual all stayed the same. Now, there are always tons of changes in the Farm Bill, but the 2018 Farm Bill, as I'm recording this, was just 2 years ago, and there isn't a good textbook that covers the Farm Bill. I thought about changing textbooks this year to this one because it was published more recently. And after I got a copy of the book in hand and started flipping through it, I saw that it was published in 2018. Well, the 18 Farm Bill was passed in December of 18. So there's no way in hell the information in this book is up to date. And so why go through the trouble of switching a textbook that was passed, that was written before the 18 Farm Bill, and likely hit shelves before the 18 Farm Bill was passed. So, I mean, I'm going to put a PDF file up in the D2L course shell that's going to explain to you some differences between the 14 and 18 Farm Bill, but there weren't a lot of differences, small incremental changes. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.